Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into something that sounds harmless, even helpful, but turns out to be one of the most slippery, catastrophic spirals in modern medical history. We're talking about Dilaudid, hospital heroin, the little white pill that your doctor handed you in a sterile room with fluorescent lights and a laminated poster about hand washing, and that somehow ended up being the black market's most wanted painkiller. Not fentanyl, not OxyContin, not some sketchy powder mixed in a bathtub. Dilaudid, the thing they give you after surgery, the thing that smells like medicine and tastes like trust. So before you get comfortable, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a very special, sincere thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and I want you to know that suggestions like yours are genuinely what shape this channel. Every comment, every message, they matter more than you'd think, and they help this little corner of the internet grow into something real. Also, the channel is now on Spotify. Link is in the description. Check it out, share it with a friend who falls asleep to podcasts and might enjoy history with their insomnia. Now, dim those lights, put on a fan, pull your blanket up to your chin, and get your feet safely tucked under the covers. We don't want anything cold and unexpected brushing your toes at midnight. Let's take a moment and just sit with some questions. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to be handed something legal, prescribed by a doctor, labelled with your own name, that turns out to be chemically almost identical to heroin? Have you ever wondered how a drug designed in a hospital ends up on a street corner 2 states away? How something that costs pennies to manufacture becomes worth more per milligram than gold on the black market? How doctors, nurses, pharmacists, smart, educated, well-meaning people ended up at the center of a distribution network more efficient than anything the cartels ever built? And perhaps most uncomfortably, could it have happened to you? Congratulations. You've just woken up somewhere between a hospital bed and a rabbit hole with no bottom. The year is sometime in the last 50 years, and hydromorphone, brand name Dilaudid, is about to have the most complicated reputation in pharmaceutical history. Let's begin. There is something deeply reassuring about a medication that sounds like it belongs in a luxury hotel. Dilaudid. It has the cadence of a Swiss spa, not a Schedule II controlled substance. But that name, clean, clinical, quietly authoritative, is precisely part of the story. Hydromorphone was synthesized in Germany in the early 1920s, a direct chemical cousin of morphine, tweaked by scientists at Knoll Pharmaceuticals who were very much trying to make a better painkiller. They succeeded. Perhaps a little too well. Because what they created was a substance roughly 2 to 8 times more potent than morphine, faster acting, shorter lasting, and with a euphoric punch that would take decades for the medical system to fully reckon with. Before hydromorphone, morphine was the gold standard of serious pain relief, and morphine worked. Nobody was arguing it didn't. But morphine had a duration problem. It lingered in the system, it accumulated with repeated dosing, and in patients with compromised kidneys or livers, managing it safely required the kind of careful titration that busy hospitals in the early 20th century were not always equipped to provide. Hydromorphone offered a cleaner profile. In, effective, out. The body processed it faster. The dosing window was more predictable. From a pure pharmacology standpoint, it was a genuine improvement. It also had, right from the beginning, a slight image advantage over its chemical relatives. Morphine carried the weight of history. Soldiers in World War I coming home with habits nobody wanted to discuss, opium dens, the whole dark century of the drug's cultural baggage. Heroin, which had been marketed by Bayer in the early 1900s as a non-addictive alternative to morphine, which, in one of pharmaceutical history's most spectacular miscalculations, it absolutely was not. Had by the 1920s been banned for medical use in the United States entirely. hydromorphone arrived in this landscape as something new. Technically new anyway. Chemically, it was operating on the exact same receptors as every other opioid that had come before it. But it had a different name, a better name, a name that sounded, when the nurse read it off the medication administration record, like something that was going to help you, and it was going to help you. That is the part of the story that is easiest to lose when you're cataloguing catastrophe. Dilaudid is a genuinely effective medication. For someone in acute pain, post-surgical, post-traumatic, in the throes of a kidney stone or a sickle cell crisis, the relief it provides is not just comfort. It is, in the most literal sense, humane. Before effective opioid analgesia, people undergoing procedures or recovering from injuries experienced suffering that we would now consider completely unacceptable. The history of pain management is, at one level, a history of medicine learning to take suffering seriously. Dilaudid was part of that project. It entered the American market in 1926, available by prescription, used cautiously at first and then less cautiously as the decades passed, and the pharmaceutical industry grew better at marketing confidence than it was at marketing caution. By the time managed care and patient satisfaction scores and the pain as the fifth vital sign movement arrived in the 1990s, hydromorphone was a trusted, familiar tool in hospitals across the country. Every doctor had used it. Every nurse had administered it. Every pharmacist had stocked it. It was just there, reliable and effective, in the same way that a very sharp knife in a professional kitchen is just there. The name helped. It still does. Dilaudid does not sound like a drug people die from. It sounds like something that fixes the problem. That's what made it so difficult to see clearly until it was far, far too late. Before Dilaudid became a street drug, it had to become a hospital drug, and to understand that, you have to understand what pain management looked like in mid-20th century America. For a long time, it looked like nothing. Doctors were terrified of addiction. Patients in genuine agony were handed aspirin and told to be grateful. The prevailing medical wisdom was that opioids were a last resort, something you gave to dying cancer patients and nobody else. This philosophy wasn't compassion, it was fear dressed up in a white coat. And the patients who suffered through it, post-surgical, post-injury, writhing through recoveries that didn't have to be that brutal, were the quiet collateral damage of a system that had decided pain was safer than treatment. This was not an irrational fear, historically speaking. The first great opioid epidemic in America had happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven largely by patent medicines, tonics and syrups and solutions freely available at the pharmacy counter, generously laced with morphine, laudanum and later heroin, marketed primarily at women for conditions described as female complaints, nervousness, or melancholy. The patients who became dependent on these products were not criminals and they were not weak. They were people who had been sold something by a respectable institution, the pharmacy, the doctor's office, the mail order catalogue, and had discovered, too late, that it had rearranged their neurochemistry in ways that couldn't simply be undone by willpower. The response to that crisis was largely prohibition and shame. Legislation in the 19-teens dramatically restricted opioid prescribing. Addiction was reframed as a moral failing rather than a medical condition, which meant that treatment was replaced by judgment, and suffering was replaced by more suffering of a different kind. For the next several decades, the medical establishment swung hard in the direction of restriction. Opioids were locked down, rationed, reserved. Patients emerging from abdominal surgery were given something inadequate and told this was the correct amount of pain relief for a person of good character. This overcorrection had its own victims. Studies emerging from the 1970s and 80s began documenting what palliative care physicians had long known informally. that pain was being systematically undertreated in American hospitals, that patients were suffering unnecessarily, and that the fear of creating addiction was being used to justify a level of neglect that would have been considered unconscionable in any other context. A landmark paper in 1980 from Doctors Herschel Jick and Jane Porter, a 5-sentence letter in the New England Journal of Medicine, noted that among nearly 12,000 hospitalized patients who received opioids, only 4 cases of addiction had been documented. That letter would later be cited, stripped of its context and limitations, hundreds of times as evidence that opioids were essentially non-addictive when used medically. It was not making that claim. But it was read as making that claim, and the misreading mattered enormously. Into this environment of overcorrection and newly weaponized optimism came Dilaudid and its pharmaceutical siblings. The pendulum swung. Pain was real. Suffering was wrong. Opioids worked. What could go wrong? The dose makes the poison. That is one of the foundational principles of pharmacology, attributed to the 16th century physician Paracelsus. Water, in large enough quantities, will kill you. Oxygen, at high enough concentrations, is toxic. The difference between medicine and poison has never been the molecule. It has always been the context, the amount, the patient, the monitoring, and the follow-up. Take away any one of those variables and the most helpful drug in the world becomes something else entirely. That is not a comfortable truth when you're trying to run a busy hospital. By the 1980s and 90s, the American healthcare system had undergone a philosophical reversal, so complete it would have been funny if the consequences weren't so catastrophic. Pain, doctors were now told, was the 5th vital sign. Patients had a right to adequate pain management. Hospitals were being graded, actually graded like a restaurant re-earned, on patient satisfaction scores that included questions about whether their pain had been taken seriously. Into this environment walked Dilaudid, fast, effective and injectable, which meant it hit faster than oral opioids, worked reliably in patients who couldn't swallow, and could be titrated precisely in an ICU. It was, by every clinical measure, a very good drug. The problem was never the drug sitting in the vial. The problem was what happened when the vial was opened. The pharmaceutical industry understood, with exquisite precision, what the new climate meant for business. Purdue Pharma is the name most commonly associated with the aggressive marketing of opioids in this era, and for good reason, but it was not operating in isolation. Across the industry, sales representatives were visiting physician offices armed with samples, speaking fees, conference invitations, and a body of literature that emphasized the benefits of opioid therapy and minimized the risks of dependency. The message was refined to the point of art. Opioids, in patients with legitimate pain, are safe. Addiction is a concern for people with addiction histories. You, doctor, are prescribing to people who are hurting. You are helping them. Keep going. Continuing medical education events, required for physicians to maintain their licenses, were funded by pharmaceutical companies and often featured speakers who were themselves on pharmaceutical company payrolls. This was legal. It was also, in retrospect, an extraordinary mechanism for distributing a particular set of ideas about opioid safety at scale to exactly the people who would turn those ideas into prescriptions. Hospitals adopted Dilaudid because it worked, and because the professional culture around them was telling them that adequate pain management was a moral imperative, and that the tools to provide it were safe. Formulary committees evaluated the drug on its clinical merits, which were real, and added it to the list. Automated dispensing machines were stocked. Nursing protocols were updated. The drug became infrastructure. It became part of the background of care, as unremarkable as an IV line or a blood pressure cuff. The global spread followed different pathways in different countries but arrived at similar destinations. In Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia and across Europe, hydromorphone found its way onto hospital formularies through the same combination of genuine clinical utility and insufficient institutional attention to the dependency risk. Some countries maintained tighter prescribing controls than the United States. Some didn't. None of them were entirely immune. By the time the scale of the crisis became impossible to ignore sometime in the early 2000s, though the warning signs had been legible for a decade before that, Dilaudid was not a fringe product used in specialised settings. It was everywhere. In teaching hospitals and rural critical access facilities, in ICUs and in emergency rooms, in the automated dispensing cabinet on the orthopaedic ward, and in the anaesthesia cart in Operating Room 5. It had been so successfully integrated into the infrastructure of care that questioning its place in that infrastructure felt, to many clinicians, like questioning whether to stop treating pain altogether. That was never the question, but it is in some ways the question the system heard. Here is the part where things get uncomfortably interesting. Hydromorphone works by binding to opioid receptors in the brain and spinal cord, specifically the mu-opioid receptor, which is, and this is the scientific term, the one that makes you feel like everything is going to be fine. Pain signals are muted, anxiety dissolves. The body, which was perhaps a few moments ago sending urgent distress signals from a surgical wound or a broken bone, simply quiets. Patients describe it as warmth, spreading from the chest outward. A softening. A sense that whatever was wrong has been gently but firmly put in a drawer, and the drawer has been closed. This is what medicine is supposed to do. It is also, it turns out, exactly what people want to feel when nothing is medically wrong with them at all. The mu-opioid receptor did not evolve to process hydromorphone. It evolved to process endorphins, the brain's endogenous opioids, released during exercise, during laughter, during moments of connection and safety. When you feel what people describe as a runner's high, or the warm calm of being deeply comfortable and loved, you are, at the neurochemical level, experiencing a mild version of what a much, much smaller dose of Dilaudid approximates. Your brain is very good at noticing when something activates those receptors effectively. It is significantly less good at distinguishing between natural activation and pharmaceutical activation. It just knows something happened that felt like safety, and it would like that to happen again. With repeated exposure to opioids, the brain does something logical and terrible simultaneously. It downregulates. It reduces the number of available receptors. It adjusts its baseline to account for the new normal. This means that the dose that produced relief last week produces less relief this week, and the dose required to return to that baseline, or to simply feel okay rather than actively unwell, creeps upward. This is physical dependence, and it is not a character flaw. It is a neurological adaptation, as automatic and value-neutral as developing a callus where your shoe rubs. What makes hydromorphone particularly powerful in this cycle is its pharmacokinetic profile, the way it enters and leaves the body. The onset of intravenous Dilaudid is approximately 5 minutes. The duration is roughly 4 hours. This means the gap between dose and effect is short enough to create a clear associative link in the brain. You received this, you felt that, in that order, and the return of discomfort after 4 hours is clear enough to remind you that another dose exists. Longer-acting opioids blur these associations slightly. Dilaudid sharpens them. There is also the matter of what happens when it wears off. The return to baseline after a dose of Dilaudid is not, in a physically dependent person, a simple return to feeling normal. It is a slide past normal into a state that feels worse than before the drug existed in their life. The technical term for this is opioid-induced hyperalgesia, increased sensitivity to pain that can develop with long-term opioid use. You came for pain relief. You stayed because stopping hurt more than starting had. None of this means that every person who receives intravenous Dilaudid in a hospital will become dependent. Most won't. Short course, acute pain use in the inpatient setting, with no prior opioid history and no ongoing prescription, represents a different risk profile from long-term outpatient use. But the brain that is sitting in the hospital bed receiving the drug does not know that it is in the low-risk category. It is just experiencing what it is experiencing, and what it is experiencing is very effective. That is the pharmacology. It is not a moral argument, it is just what happens. Every story about hospital drug diversion, the polite term for stealing controlled substances from a medical facility, starts the same way. Not with a villain. With a colleague who started calling in sick a lot. A pharmacist who noticed the numbers didn't add up. A supervisor who found a syringe that shouldn't have been there. Dilaudid diversion inside hospitals has been happening since the drug entered widespread clinical use, and it follows patterns so consistent, so predictable, that criminologists and addiction specialists can practically set their watches by them. It starts with access. Healthcare workers, particularly nurses and anesthesiologists, have something that street-level dealers would kill for: legitimate, legal, institutional access to pure pharmaceutical-grade opioids. The access is not incidental to the job. It is the job. A nurse administering pain medications on a post-surgical ward may be handling Dilaudid multiple times per shift, drawing it up, administering it, documenting the amount given and the amount wasted. The automation of this process through systems like Pyxis dispensing machines added layers of accountability, but it also added new vectors for manipulation. If a patient was ordered 2 milligrams and only needed 1, the nurse was supposed to waste the remainder in the presence of a witness. In busy hospitals where everyone was stretched, the witness requirement was sometimes observed with more paperwork than attention. Healthcare workers who divert controlled substances are not, in the typical case, people who enter the profession intending to steal drugs. They are people who, somewhere in the course of their working lives, began using a substance that they had access to and that worked, for stress, for pain, for the accumulated weight of a job that asks people to witness suffering constantly and offers insufficient support for carrying it. The addiction literature is consistent on this point. Healthcare workers who develop opioid use disorder tend to do so in the context of the same stresses that drive burnout in the broader workforce. They just happen to have a solution available at arm's length. The nurse who noticed in these stories was also a nurse who didn't want to notice. Reporting a colleague for drug diversion initiated a process that could end their career, destroy their family, and result in criminal charges. The person being reported might be someone you had worked alongside for a decade, someone you liked, someone who was, outside of this one terrible thing, genuinely good at their job. The formal term for the reluctance to act on these observations is bystander inaction. The informal term is the thing that allowed diversion to continue in hospitals across the country for far longer than it should have. When the reports were finally filed, and they were eventually, when the patterns became undeniable, the investigations that followed were often grim case studies in how completely a determined person with insider knowledge could manipulate a system. Controlled substance logs with plausible-looking alterations. Patient medication records that showed administration at times when security footage placed the nurse elsewhere. Waste documentation signed by colleagues who attested to witnessing disposal that had not occurred. The hospital that discovered the problem rarely went public with it. The employee was quietly separated. The investigation was conducted internally. The licensing board was notified, usually eventually. The patients whose medications had been diverted, who had received saline instead of hydromorphone, and had wondered why their pain wasn't being controlled, and had been told they were getting adequate doses, those patients were rarely informed. Informed consent does not extend to informing someone that they suffered unnecessarily because their nurse stole their pain medication. This is not a legal requirement. It is just a kind of institutional silence that follows these cases like a shadow. If you wanted to design a profession that created maximum vulnerability to opioid addiction, you would invent anesthesiology. These are the physicians who spend their entire working lives in rooms where powerful drugs are being drawn into syringes, administered by the milliliter, and in the curious logic of operating room accounting, partially wasted. Wasted in this context means that whatever was drawn into the syringe but not administered to the patient must be documented and disposed of, properly, in theory. In practice, the operating room is a fast-moving, high-pressure environment where a significant amount of trust is placed in a small number of highly trained people, and some of those people, over years of exposure to drugs that offer instant relief from stress, begin using what they were supposed to be discarding. The rates of substance use disorder among anesthesiologists are higher than in the general physician population. This is not a disputed finding. It has been documented in the medical literature consistently enough that anesthesiology residency programs now include specific training on the occupational risk, screening for vulnerability, and protocols for seeking help before the problem becomes a crisis. The question that took the profession an embarrassingly long time to ask seriously is, why is this happening, and what is the environment doing to enable it? Part of the answer is simple availability. An anesthesiologist controlling the drug cart in an operating room has access, during any given case, to fentanyl, propofol, midazolam, hydromorphone, ketamine, and a rotating cast of other controlled and semi-controlled substances. The documentation requirements are real but imperfect. Drawing up a slightly larger dose than the patient will require, or documenting a waste amount that doesn't precisely match what remains in the syringe, are both things that happen in operating rooms every day for legitimate clinical reasons. Distinguishing those events from diversion requires either a very robust monitoring system or a very suspicious colleague, and operating rooms historically have had less of the former than you might hope. The other part of the answer is the job itself. Anesthesiology is a specialty that rewards composure and precision under conditions of genuine life and death pressure. The emotional labour of keeping a patient stable during a complex surgical case, of managing a respiratory crisis, of making rapid decisions with incomplete information is not trivial. And the cultural norms of medicine, which have historically celebrated stoicism and punished visible vulnerability, meant that anesthesiologists who were struggling had very few safe places to take that information. Self-medicating with something available at work was not the rational response to that environment, but it was a human one. The pattern of impairment in anesthesiologists tends to be particularly dangerous because the drugs of choice, opioids, primarily, but also propofol and other sedatives, can be used in a way that maintains functional performance, at least initially. A physician who was drinking at work would show signs. An anesthesiologist who was administering small supplementary doses of fentanyl during long cases might not. The impairment was internal, pharmacological, and invisible to anyone who wasn't watching the drug logs with granular attention. When these cases were discovered, through the drug logs, through a colleague's observation, through a patient outcome that prompted review, the response within the profession for many years was not treatment. It was removal and concealment. The physician was quietly asked to leave. The licensing board was sometimes notified and sometimes not. The hospital moved on. This approach protected the institution. It did not protect the physician, and it did not protect the next patient in the care of the next impaired colleague whose situation had not yet been discovered. The profession has done better, gradually, reluctantly, and with persistent advocacy from the people who went through this and survived to talk about it. But the particular problem of the anesthesiologist with access and a bad day is not a historical artifact. It is an ongoing occupational reality. Not all Dilaudid dependency starts in a hospital corridor. Some of it starts in a hospital bed. You go in for a surgery, something real, something that genuinely hurts. You're given intravenous hydromorphone for the pain. It works. Of course it works. You feel, possibly for the first time in weeks, like a human being who is not being consumed by their own nervous system. Then the surgery heals. The doctor begins tapering your pain management, and somewhere in your brain, a system that was not consulted during this decision begins to protest. Not loudly at first, just a low, insistent awareness that there is a version of feeling okay that you have now experienced, and that the version you are currently experiencing does not compare. This is not a weakness. It is important to say that clearly, because the narrative around people who became dependent on prescription opioids has historically been soaked in the language of weakness, of people who couldn't handle it, who lacked willpower, who should have known better. That narrative is not only wrong, it is specifically, precisely wrong in a way that has caused measurable harm by delaying treatment and increasing shame. The neurochemistry of opioid dependency does not care about your character. It cares about receptor occupancy. It will do the same thing to a decorated veteran as to a high school dropout, to a marathon runner as to someone who has never exercised, to someone who has every reason to want to be healthy and every resource to pursue it. The brain that has been introduced to effective opioid analgesia will remember it, and it will ask for it again. What varies is not vulnerability in some deep character sense, but context, the length of exposure, the dose, the presence or absence of prior trauma or chronic pain, the availability of alternative coping strategies, and, critically, the presence of a healthcare provider who's monitoring for dependency and prepared to treat it rather than judge it. In the era when Dilaudid was being prescribed most aggressively, that monitoring was often absent. Patients were discharged with follow-up prescriptions and limited follow-up care. The transition from acute to chronic opioid use happened in the spaces between appointments, in the late-night hours when pain felt unbearable, and a refill seemed like the only sensible solution. The patient who wanted more was also, often, a patient who had legitimate reasons to want more. Chronic pain, real, ongoing, difficult to treat chronic pain, affects a significant proportion of the adult population. For many people, opioid therapy represented the first treatment that made their pain manageable enough to function. When the drug works, the impulse to continue it is not irrational. It is the impulse to remain functional. The problem is that the brain does not maintain a stable response to opioids over time. What worked at 2 milligrams eventually requires 4. What required 4 escalates further, and the doctor, confronted with a patient in genuine pain whose current dose has stopped working, faces a choice between escalating a medication that has already altered the patient's neurochemistry and withdrawing it, which will cause a different kind of suffering the doctor can also see and has limited tools to address. Some patients navigated this system and eventually got what they needed: tapered doses, alternative therapies, addiction treatment when that became necessary, and enough support to reach the other side. Many did not. Many found themselves at the end of a prescription in a body that had reorganized itself around the drug, with a phone number for a taper schedule and no other guidance. And the next step for a significant number of them was the question of where you get Dilaudid when the prescription runs out. The answer to that question is what this story is really about. By the time Dilaudid was earning nicknames, Dillies, hospital heroin, the good stuff, it had already established a footprint in the black market that most people outside addiction medicine didn't know existed. The street value of a single 4 milligram Dilaudid tablet in the early 2000s was somewhere between $40 and $100, depending on your city and how desperate the buyer was. For context, a prescription bottle of 30 tablets, obtained through insurance for a copay of a few dollars, represented a street value of over $1,000. The math was not complicated, and the people doing the math were not always who you'd expect. They were not, at least not initially, career criminals. They were people with prescriptions, or people who knew people with prescriptions, who had discovered a gap between what the healthcare system valued something at and what the open market would pay. The geography of the Dilaudid black market followed the geography of prescribing. Communities where opioids were prescribed at the highest rates, certain rural areas of Appalachia, post-industrial towns across the Midwest, communities where work-related injury was common and specialist care was scarce, tended also to be communities where the black market was most active. This was not a coincidence. It was a distribution system. The drug flowed from the clinic to the street along pathways that mirrored, with uncomfortable precision, the legitimate supply chain, doctor to pharmacy to patient to informal redistribution. The nickname hospital heroin was both accurate and misleading. Accurate because the drug was chemically close to heroin, close enough that a person accustomed to illicit opioids would find it familiar and effective. Misleading because the connotations of heroin implied a different kind of user in the public imagination, someone marginalized, someone already outside the mainstream. The people using black market Dilaudid in the early 2000s were, statistically, predominantly white, predominantly rural or suburban, and often had begun their opioid use with a legitimate prescription. They were not the imagined heroin user. They were the neighbour, the co-worker, the person you sat next to at church. This demographic reality complicated the public health response in ways that were both shameful and consequential. The street names multiplied regionally. In some cities it was dillies. In others, the drug was referred to by its milligram strength, 4s, 8s, the 10s meaning the 10 milligram tablets. Injectable formulations that had been diverted from hospital supplies earned a particular premium because they could be used intravenously, which produced a faster and more intense effect. A vial of injectable hydromorphone that should have been documented as wasted in a hospital supply room and instead ended up in a dealer's inventory represented both a failure of institutional controls and a commodity that would change hands multiple times before it reached its final destination. The craving that drove this market is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced opioid dependency and easy to dismiss if you're inclined toward the moral failing interpretation. But here is what the research consistently shows. The behavior of people who are physically dependent on opioids looks, from the outside, like compulsive irrationality, spending money they don't have, taking risks that don't make logical sense, prioritizing drug access over other needs. From the inside, it is experienced as meeting a physiological need that has the same urgency as hunger or thirst, combined with the psychological need to avoid a withdrawal state that most people who have experienced it describe as the worst they have ever felt. The geography of craving is your body, and it has no postal code. The most efficient delivery mechanism for black market Dilaudid was never a hospital heist or a pharmacy break-in. It was a prescription pad. In certain corners of the American South and Midwest during the late 90s and early 2000s, pain clinics opened with a speed and density that defied any honest explanation. These were the pill mills, medical practices that operated within the technical boundaries of the law while functioning in practice as cash-for-scripts operations. Patients travelled hours, sometimes across state lines, to sit in a waiting room for 20 minutes, hand over cash, and walk out with a month's supply of controlled substances. The doctor signing the prescriptions was not, in most cases, a monster. They were often someone who had started out believing they were helping undertreated pain patients and had slowly, incrementally compromised themselves into something they probably couldn't recognize anymore. Florida was the epicenter. At the peak of the pill mill era, the state was home to nearly half of all the pain clinics in the United States. They clustered in strip malls, in medical parks, in converted storefronts with hand-lettered signs and waiting rooms full of people from out of state who had driven through the night to be first in line when the doors opened. The doctors who signed the prescriptions, and there were hundreds of them, operated with a degree of latitude that the regulatory environment had made possible and the pharmaceutical industry had made profitable. Florida did not have a prescription drug monitoring program until 2011. That is not a typo. For more than a decade of the crisis, a prescriber in Florida had no accessible database to check whether the patient in front of them had received 100 oxycodone tablets from the clinic down the road the previous Tuesday. The mechanics of a pill mill were not subtle in retrospect. Patients paid in cash. Examinations were cursory or fictitious. Diagnoses were documented to justify prescriptions: back pain, headache, neuropathy, without the imaging, the specialist referrals, or the treatment histories that would ordinarily accompany those diagnoses. The prescriptions were high dose and frequently written for multiple controlled substances simultaneously. An opioid plus a benzodiazepine, a combination whose synergistic respiratory depressant effect was responsible for a significant proportion of overdose deaths. The pharmacy down the street, which in some cases had financial relationships with the clinic, would fill them without question. The doctors who ran these operations knew what they were doing, at least eventually. The ones who started in genuine ignorance, who believed that pain was undertreated and that they were addressing a healthcare gap, encountered, at some point, the evidence that their practice had become something different. Patients who clearly were not in the pain they described. The same faces returning every month like clockwork, not seeking care, but seeking supply. The parking lots full of out-of-state license plates. The cash in the till at the end of the day that was substantially more than any legitimate pain practice would generate. The moment of recognition came for different physicians at different points. What some did with that recognition, which was nothing, which was keep signing, is the part of the story that requires some accounting. The prosecutions, when they eventually came, produced testimony that was occasionally mundane in its specificity and devastating in its accumulated weight. A physician who signed 100 prescriptions a day. A clinic that generated tens of thousands of dollars in cash per week. The downstream deaths, the overdoses that could be traced, through pharmacy records and medical examiner reports and careful epidemiology, back to a specific prescription signed by a specific physician who knew, or should have known, what they were doing. The legal standard is prescribing outside the bounds of legitimate medical practice. It sounds technical. What it means is, you did this on purpose. There is a particular kind of damage done to the medical system when it is used as a pipeline for abuse, and it is not primarily financial. The damage is relational. For every patient who walked into an emergency room genuinely in agony after an accident, and was treated with appropriate suspicion because the last 20 people who presented with similar complaints were drug-seeking, there was a physician who had slowly stopped being able to tell the difference between a person in pain and a person in need of a hit. The clinical term for this is opioid-seeking behavior. The human term for it is a doctor who's been lied to so many times they have armored themselves against the truth. This is one of the quieter catastrophes of the Dilaudid era. The erosion of trust between patients and providers that made everyone, including the genuinely suffering, harder to help. The language of drug-seeking entered clinical training, and it did not stay neutral for long. It became, in practice, a way of describing patients who advocated for themselves. Patients who were knowledgeable about their medications. Patients who reported high pain scores. Patients who asked for specific drugs by name because they had previously been treated with those drugs and knew they worked. All of these are also behaviours exhibited by people in genuine pain who have some experience with the healthcare system. The the clinical skill required to distinguish them reliably is significant. The training to develop that skill was inconsistent, and the consequences of guessing wrong cut in both directions. Overprescribe and you contribute to the crisis. Underprescribe and you leave someone in uncontrolled pain, possibly send them to the street to find their own solution, and damage their trust in medicine in a way that is very difficult to repair. The populations who bore the greatest burden of the undertreatment side of this equation were not random. Black patients in the United States, documented in study after study, were prescribed opioids at lower rates than white patients for equivalent pain presentations. The explanations offered in the literature for this finding are grim. Implicit bias, false beliefs about physiological differences in pain sensitivity, a cultural legacy of medical experimentation and abuse that made black patients less likely to advocate for stronger pain relief and made some physicians less likely to hear them when they did. The erosion of trust in this context was not a new development caused by the opioid crisis. It was a pre-existing condition that the opioid crisis interacted with in ways that illuminated, once again, the differential cost of a broken system. Patients with a history of addiction faced their own version of this. The clinical documentation of a prior substance use disorder became, for many people, a scarlet letter that followed them through the healthcare system for the rest of their lives. An emergency room visit for a broken arm, post-recovery, might be met with a level of scrutiny applied to their pain management that a patient without that history would not receive. This is, from a pure risk management perspective, understandable. It is also, from the patient's perspective, a punishment for having had a problem and a structural disincentive to seeking care or disclosing history honestly. The doctors who are not looking away, who are trying to provide appropriate care in this environment, will tell you that the hardest part was not identifying the clear cases. The obviously drug-seeking patient with 6 prior visits and a perfectly consistent story about lost prescriptions was not a diagnostic puzzle. The hard part was the middle, the person who might genuinely be in pain and might also be dependent, the person whose X-ray doesn't show anything but whose pain is real regardless. Medicine in the middle of the opioid crisis was, for many practitioners, an experience of chronic moral uncertainty conducted under institutional time pressure with inadequate support. Some of them burned out. Some of them stopped prescribing opioids almost entirely, including for patients who needed them. Some of them just kept going, doing the best they could, which was sometimes good and sometimes wasn't, and trying not to think too hard about the ones who fell through. Every hospital maintains a formulary, a list of approved medications that can be ordered by physicians and dispensed by the pharmacy. Dilaudid earned a prominent place on virtually every hospital formulary in the United States because it works, because it is titratable, because it can be administered through virtually every route, and because its efficacy in post-surgical and acute pain settings is genuinely difficult to argue with. What the formulary does not tell you is how many opportunities for diversion exist between the pharmacy and the patient. The drug moves through nurses, through automated dispensing machines, through anesthesia carts, through waste documentation processes, and at each handoff there is a moment, brief, often unwitnessed, where a small quantity of a very powerful substance passes through human hands. The hospital pharmacy is the nominal control point. Controlled substances arrive from the wholesaler in sealed containers, are logged into the pharmacy inventory, and are dispensed against physician orders. The documentation trail, in a functioning system, connects each vial of hydromorphone from its manufacturer to a specific patient at a specific time in a specific dose. When an audit is conducted and the numbers add up, the system is working. When the numbers don't add up, something has gone wrong somewhere in that chain, and the audit is the mechanism that finds it. The problem is that audits are retrospective. They tell you what happened, not what is happening. A well-designed monitoring system catches diversion after it has occurred, often after it has occurred many times. The gap between the first act of diversion and the discovery of that pattern can be months or years, depending on the sophistication of the diverter and the attentiveness of the system. During that gap, the drug is moving, the employee is continuing, and the patients whose medications were compromised are receiving inadequate pain control with no awareness that this is why. Automated dispensing machines, Pyxis and Omnicell are the dominant brands, were introduced in part specifically to improve controlled substance accountability. They require a nurse to log in with biometric or password authentication before accessing a controlled substance. They record the quantity removed. They generate reconciliation reports that flag discrepancies between what was taken out and what was documented as administered or wasted. They are, in theory, a significant improvement over a locked cabinet and a handwritten log. In practice, they are a system that can be manipulated by someone with enough access, enough time, and enough knowledge of how the reconciliation reports work. The override function is a particular vulnerability. In an emergency, a nurse may need a medication before the pharmacy has processed a formal order. Most automated dispensing machines allow an override, a removal of medication from inventory without a preceding order, documented after the fact. Legitimate overrides happen constantly in urgent clinical situations. They're also, in the diversion literature, one of the most commonly exploited access points, because the documentation is generated after the fact and often reviewed long after the fact, if at all. The formulary, the dispensing machine, the waste documentation, the reconciliation report, each is a layer of control, and each has a workaround that has been found and used. The illusion of control is not unique to hospitals. It is the universal gap between the system as designed and the system as actually operated by human beings under pressure in the middle of the night. The gap is small enough that most drugs most of the time reach the patients they were intended for, but Dilaudid is not most drugs. It is a drug that some people are willing to go to significant lengths to obtain. And where there is significant willingness, small gaps become large enough to matter. PCA stands for patient-controlled analgesia, which sounds progressive and humane, and genuinely is. The idea is that patients in post-surgical recovery can self-administer small doses of pain medication at the press of a button, within programmed limits, rather than waiting for a nurse to bring medication on a schedule. The machine is smarter than it sounds. It locks out repeated requests within a window. It tracks how many doses were requested versus delivered, and it logs everything. What it cannot do is verify that the person pressing the button is the patient. Hospital workers have been caught administering PCA doses to patients who are asleep or sedated, then pocketing the medication. Other diversion schemes involve manipulating the waste documentation, claiming the patient received medication that was actually redirected. The pump logs, the math is checked, eventually, usually. PCA therapy was developed out of a genuine clinical insight. Patients, given control over their own pain medication within safe limits, tend to use less of it than scheduled dosing would provide. They report higher satisfaction with their pain management and they recover faster. The anxiety of waiting for a nurse who might not come, of pain escalating past a threshold that a single scheduled dose can no longer address, produces a stress response that is itself physiologically counterproductive. Give the patient the button and a programmable ceiling, and you address that anxiety while preventing overdose. It is, in clinical terms, elegant. The hydromorphone PCA became a standard of post-surgical care for moderate to severe pain. It was efficient, it was well tolerated, and the safety record in patients who were appropriately selected and monitored was reasonable. But the pump's elegance created a specific assumption. that the system was sufficiently automated that close human supervision was not constantly required, and that assumption, when exploited, produced a particular kind of harm. A patient receiving saline instead of hydromorphone because the nurse had bypassed the cartridge and pocketed the drug is not experiencing PCA therapy. They are experiencing the appearance of PCA therapy while being left in uncontrolled pain by the person responsible for their care. The cases in which this occurred were not thankfully common, but they were documented, prosecuted, and reported in the nursing and pharmacy literature with enough frequency to constitute a pattern. They also represented a category of harm that was unusually difficult to detect from the patient's perspective. A post-surgical patient whose pain medication is working will use their button and feel relief. A post-surgical patient whose cartridge has been replaced with saline will use their button and feel nothing, and will likely be told that their pain expectations are unrealistic or that their dose needs adjustment. The patient does not know what they are receiving. That asymmetry of information is what made this form of diversion particularly ugly. The hospital's response when cases were identified followed a pattern: investigation, termination, licensing board notification, criminal charges in the most egregious cases, and then, across the industry, protocol adjustments, more frequent reconciliation of PCA cartridges, witness requirements for cartridge changes, video monitoring in certain areas. Each scandal produced a procedural response. The procedural responses accumulated into a system that is meaningfully better than what existed before. It is still not a closed system. No system that requires human beings to handle controlled substances in a busy clinical environment ever will be. The honor system never fully disappears. It just gets watched more carefully. What the PCA pump story really illustrates is the fundamental tension at the center of hospital drug management. The infrastructure of care requires trust, and trust can be violated. You cannot run a hospital in a state of constant mutual suspicion between every nurse and every pharmacist and every physician. The system requires good faith to function. The people who exploited that good faith understood it better than anyone, and the patients who paid the price for it were the ones who had every reason to believe that pressing a button would bring relief. No conversation about why Dilaudid became the black market's favourite painkiller makes any sense without spending some time inside the body of someone who needs it and doesn't have it. Opioid withdrawal is not, despite what you might hope, simply a bad flu. It begins with anxiety, a creeping, sourceless dread that arrives before any physical symptoms. Then come the sweats, then the chills, then a kind of bone-deep aching that patients consistently describe as feeling like their skeleton is trying to escape through their skin. The stomach cramps begin. The insomnia is absolute, exhausted beyond functioning but unable to sleep, lying awake in a body that has decided to declare war on itself. This lasts in its acute phase approximately 3 to 5 days, and the psychological craving, the specific hunger for the absence of this feeling, can last years. The clinical name for this is opioid withdrawal syndrome. The experience of it, described by people who have been through it, tends to use words that clinical language is not built to contain. Patients who have survived both opioid withdrawal and serious illness, including cancer treatment, frequently rank withdrawal as among the worst physical experiences of their lives. This matters because it explains, at the neurobiological level, why people go to the length they go to in order to avoid it. Avoiding withdrawal is not choosing a high. It's choosing not to be tortured by your own body. The distinction is not semantic. It is the reason why rational people do things that look, from the outside, completely irrational. The specific timeline of hydromorphone withdrawal is somewhat more compressed than morphine or methadone withdrawal, owing to the drug's shorter half-life. Symptoms typically begin 6 to 12 hours after the last dose. By 24 hours, the physical symptoms are in full force: rhinorrhea, the profuse runny nose that is one of the most reliably reported features, severe muscle aches, anxiety that can reach the level of panic, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and the paradoxical hypersensitivity to pain that makes the aching worse than it would otherwise be. Piloerection, goosebumps, essentially persistent and involuntary, gives the skin the appearance and texture that inspired the phrase cold turkey, a reference to the goosebumped skin of a cold-plucked bird. None of this is fatal in otherwise healthy adults. That distinction is important medically and is used in healthcare contexts to justify less aggressive management than patients sometimes feel their suffering warrants. But it is also a statement that requires context. Withdrawal from benzodiazepines or alcohol can be fatal. Withdrawal from opioids in a healthy adult is not typically fatal. It is, however, genuinely and comprehensively terrible in a way that healthy adults rarely experience otherwise. And in people who are elderly, or who have compromised cardiovascular systems, or who are going through withdrawal while also managing untreated psychiatric illness, the complications can be severe. The psychological dimension of withdrawal is the piece that determines long-term outcomes. Acute physical withdrawal resolves. What does not resolve on the same timeline is the protracted abstinence syndrome, the months or years during which brain chemistry is recalibrating toward baseline, during which sleep is disrupted, mood is dysregulated, and the craving for opioids resurfaces in response to stress, to environmental cues, to sensory reminders of the drug, with an intensity that bears no proportion to how long ago the last dose was taken. The person who has been abstinent for 18 months, who walks past the hospital where they first received Dilaudid, who catches the specific chemical smell of an IV flush in a clinical setting, may experience a craving response that feels neurologically indistinguishable from early withdrawal. This is not weakness of will. It is a conditioned physiological response. It is also why short-term detoxification, in the absence of ongoing treatment, has very poor outcomes. Getting through withdrawal is not the same as getting better. Getting through withdrawal is just the beginning of the actual work. Emergency rooms became, during the height of the Dilaudid crisis, a kind of unintentional distribution hub. Not because emergency physicians were corrupt, most weren't, but because of the structural logic of emergency medicine. An ER physician sees a patient for 20 to 40 minutes on average. They have incomplete history, no longitudinal relationship, and a mandate to treat acute pain. Someone presenting with a migraine, kidney stones, or back pain, all genuinely agonizing conditions, all also easily simulated, could receive intravenous Dilaudid in the ER, experience relief, and walk out. Some of them came back the next week, and the week after that. ER drug-seeking behavior has its own clinical vocabulary, its own red flags, its own training modules. But the emergency room is, by its nature, a place where the benefit of the doubt is extended, because the cost of refusing treatment to someone in genuine pain is too high to accept. The patterns that emergency physicians learned to identify were real, but they were also incomplete. A patient who presents to 3 different emergency rooms in the same city within a 10-day period, complaining of the same condition, requesting the same medication by name, and reporting allergy to all non-opioid alternatives, that pattern is recognizable. It also describes, with fairly high accuracy, the behavior of someone in genuine undertreated chronic pain navigating a fragmented system that has no coordinated record of their care. The drug seeker and the undertreated chronic pain patient are sometimes the same person. More often, the system is not equipped to tell them apart. Pre-prescription monitoring programs, an emergency physician in one facility had no mechanism to access another facility's records. If a patient presented with a compelling pain history, an absence of documented prior visits, and a reasonable demeanour, the physician made a clinical judgment call with the information they had. Across large metropolitan areas, patients who understood this could and did construct very effective access patterns, visiting different emergency rooms on a rotation that kept them below any individual facility's threshold for flagging. This was not sophisticated criminal behaviour. It was adaptive behaviour by people who had a physical need and had identified a system that would meet it, at least intermittently. The emergency room physicians who bore the weight of this were not uniformly sympathetic figures in the literature or in the cultural narrative of the opioid crisis. They were sometimes framed as the weakest link, the point at which drugs most easily left the medical system. This framing is unfair in ways that matter. Emergency physicians were not the architect of the opioid crisis. They were workers in a system that had been designed by the pharmaceutical industry, by hospital administrators, by regulators, by the cultural moment of pain as the fifth vital sign, to prescribe opioids generously. They had been trained to treat pain aggressively. They had patient satisfaction scores that included feedback on pain management, and they were expected simultaneously to identify and refuse treatment to people whose need was not legitimate, using clinical tools that were not equal to the task. Some emergency departments developed specific protocols in response to the volume of opioid-related presentations, care agreements, patient registries, rapid referral to addiction services. These efforts were unevenly implemented and unevenly funded. They helped in the facilities that had resources to sustain them. They did not solve the structural problem, which was that the emergency room was being asked to be simultaneously the point of last resort for people in uncontrolled pain and the firewall against a drug crisis it had not created and could not by itself contain. In the architecture of prescription drug abuse, the pharmacist is often the last line of defense before a controlled substance leaves the healthcare system and enters the black market. And for a surprisingly long time, that last line of defense had very few tools. A pharmacist in one state could not see that a patient had filled an identical prescription at 6 pharmacies in 3 other states over the previous 2 weeks. Prescription monitoring programs, databases that track controlled substance prescriptions across prescribers and dispensaries, were not universally adopted in the United States until years after the opioid crisis was already ravaging communities. Before that, the only information a pharmacist had was what was standing in front of them, and a valid prescription was, legally and practically, a valid prescription. Pharmacists occupy a structurally ambiguous position in the controlled substance supply chain. They have professional and legal obligations to dispense medications that are prescribed in accordance with applicable law. They also have professional judgment obligations. A pharmacist has the right, and in some circumstances the duty, to refuse to fill a prescription that does not appear to be issued in the course of legitimate medical practice. The space between those two obligations is where the hard cases live. A prescription that is facially valid, signed by a licensed physician, for a medication within the range of typical prescribing, for a patient who presents coherent identification, does not obviously require refusal. The pharmacist is not a physician. They did not examine the patient. They do not have access to the clinical record. And yet, the pharmacist who dispensed for the pill mill 2 blocks away saw things that did not require a clinical examination to notice. The same patients, every month, exact same prescriptions paid in cash. Prescriptions from out-of-state physicians at implausible addresses. Combinations of medications, opioid plus benzodiazepine plus carisoprodol, for example, that had essentially no legitimate simultaneous prescribing indication and a well-documented synergistic overdose risk. Some pharmacists refused these prescriptions, documented their concerns, contacted the licensing board. Many did not, citing legal uncertainty about their right to refuse valid prescriptions. professional anxiety about patient relationships, and in some cases simply the volume of business that the pill mill traffic represented. The legal exposure of pharmacies that filled pill mill prescriptions eventually became a significant feature of the civil litigation that followed the crisis. Large pharmacy chains paid substantial settlements. Individual pharmacists faced licensing consequences, but the accountability arrived a decade after the pattern had been visible to anyone who was looking. The pharmacist who saw the pattern and reported it was, during the height of the crisis, in a lonely position. The infrastructure to support that report, the prescription monitoring database, the regulator who would act on the information, the legal clarity about the pharmacist's right and duty to refuse was either absent or underfunded. The pattern was visible. The mechanism to act on it was not. Prescription monitoring programs, when they were eventually implemented and linked across state lines, worked. The data is clear on this. States with robust, actively used monitoring programs saw reductions in the most flagrant diversion patterns. The person picking up prescriptions from 12 physicians went from invisible to a red flag in the system within days. The technology was not complicated. It was a database. The delay in implementing it was not technical. It was political, institutional, and financial, a confluence of interests, including pharmaceutical industry lobbying, that slowed the adoption of a straightforward accountability tool for years during which people were dying. This is the part that tends to surprise people who assume there is a clean dividing line between pharmaceutical drugs and street drugs. Hydromorphone, the active ingredient in Dilaudid, is produced by taking morphine and making a specific chemical modification to it, a reduction of one oxygen molecule essentially. The resulting compound is more lipid-soluble than morphine, meaning it crosses the blood-brain barrier faster and more completely. This is why it hits harder and faster. It is also why, when people who were using black-market heroin were eventually tested after switching to Dilaudid, obtained through medical channels or prescription fraud, many of them reported that the pharmaceutical product was more effective than what they had been using on the street. Not because street heroin was weaker in principle, it often wasn't, but because pharmaceutical-grade hydromorphone came without the terrifying unpredictability of unknown purity and unknown adulterants. Heroin, diacetylmorphine, is also chemically derived from morphine. It works, in the body, by being rapidly converted back to morphine and morphine metabolites after administration. The euphoric effect of heroin is primarily attributable to how fast it crosses the blood-brain barrier, which is faster than morphine but, in the case of pharmaceutical-grade IV hydromorphone, not necessarily faster than Dilaudid given by the same route. What this means practically is that there is no meaningful experiential discontinuity between the street opioid world and the pharmaceutical opioid world. There is no drugstore versus drug den demarcation in the brain. There is mu receptor activation, and there is the degree of it. The molecule delivering that activation comes with a label or it doesn't. The comparison that the pharmacology invites between Dilaudid and heroin was one that the pharmaceutical industry and the medical establishment were actively resistant to making during the era of aggressive opioid prescribing. The word heroin triggered a set of cultural associations, urban, racialized, criminal, that the word Dilaudid did not. Naming the pharmacological similarity too clearly would have complicated the marketing of pharmaceutical opioids as safe, and the characterization of people who became dependent on them as having made choices categorically different from heroin users. Both were politically and commercially inconvenient truths. The street drug users who switched from heroin to pharmaceutical Dilaudid when it became available were engaging in a rational harm reduction decision, whether or not they would have used that language. A drug of known purity, known potency, manufactured under federal regulation, was in several meaningful ways less dangerous than a drug of unknown origin, mixed by people with no quality control obligations. This does not mean that pharmaceutical Dilaudid was safe for non-medical use. It means that the harm profile was different, and in some respects more manageable than the alternative. The harm reduction community understood this for years before the mainstream public health response caught up to it. The chemistry, then, is a challenge to several comfortable stories simultaneously. It challenges the story that pharmaceutical opioids and street drugs are categorically different. It challenges the story that becoming dependent on a prescribed medication is fundamentally different from becoming dependent on an illicit one. And it challenges the story that the opioid crisis was a story about bad actors making bad choices, rather than a story about a class of molecules with powerful effects on the human brain being distributed at scale with insufficient attention to those effects. The chemistry doesn't care about the story. The chemistry just does what it does. Every major shift in how hospitals manage controlled substances can be traced back to a specific incident that made the abstract suddenly, horrifically concrete. At hospitals across North America, those incidents happened in patterns. A patient given the wrong dose because a decimal point was misread. A nursing staff member found unconscious in a supply room. A post-surgical patient who stopped breathing because their pain management was inadequately monitored. Dilaudid, because of its potency and speed of onset, features prominently in hospital medication error literature. A tenfold dosing error with hydromorphone, a mistake made easier by the fact that it comes in multiple concentrations, can be fatal. And yet the drug remained on formularies, remained in automated dispensing machines, remained the go-to option for acute pain management because the alternative, undertreated pain, had its own body count. The medication error literature around hydromorphone is substantial enough to have generated its own dedicated safety bulletins from the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, which tracks drug-related errors in healthcare settings. The specific failure modes cluster predictably. Confusion between hydromorphone and morphine in high-stress settings, where both drugs are available and both are commonly ordered. Confusion between the 2 mg per milliliter and the 10 mg per milliliter concentrations of injectable hydromorphone. Decimal point errors in verbal orders that result in a tenfold dose being administered. And patient-controlled analgesia pump programming errors that deliver the drug at the wrong basal rate. The magnitude of these errors matters more with hydromorphone than with many other medications because of the drug's potency relative to morphine. A tenfold overdose of a mildly sedating antihistamine might cause uncomfortable drowsiness. A tenfold overdose of hydromorphone will kill you. This is not a hypothetical. There are documented cases in the ISMP database, and in the medical literature more broadly, of patients who died or suffered permanent neurological injury as a result of hydromorphone dosing errors that were preventable. The root causes identified in the subsequent investigations are consistent. Look-alike, sound-alike drug naming and packaging. High-pressure environments where the mental bandwidth for double-checking was absent. Staffing ratios that reduce supervision, and organizational cultures where questioning a physician's order was experienced as professionally risky. The protocols that changed after these events were real improvements. Hospitals removed high-concentration hydromorphone from floor stock and restricted it to pharmacy dispensing for individual orders. Look-alike packaging was addressed with labeling changes and physical separation in storage. PCA pump programming was standardized and double-checked by 2 nurses before initiation. These were not expensive interventions. They were, in most cases, the kind of process changes that could have been implemented years earlier if the problem had been identified and prioritized. The identification happened after the event. The prioritization happened after the public reporting. This is not a health system-specific failure. It is human institution failure, the tendency to optimize for the current steady state until the current steady state produces something undeniable. The overdose that changed a hospital's protocols was, at its core, a statement about what it takes to move institutions. It takes a body in many cases. It takes a lawsuit in others. It takes a regulatory finding or a headline or a Joint Commission accreditation review. The protocols that govern how Dilaudid moves through modern hospitals are written in the ink of those events, and the people who didn't survive them are the reason the current system is better than the one that existed before. The intersection of combat-related injury, inadequate mental health infrastructure, and aggressive opioid prescribing within the Veterans Administration healthcare system is one of the less reported chapters of the Dilaudid story. Veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan with chronic pain from blast injuries, shrapnel wounds, and spinal trauma were entering a healthcare system that was, simultaneously, under political pressure to treat them generously and structurally unprepared to provide the kind of integrated longitudinal pain management that chronic pain actually requires. Dilaudid, efficient and effective in the acute setting, was not designed to be a long-term solution for the complex, multi-layered pain experience of someone who has been through combat. It was designed for post-surgical recovery. The gap between what the drug was for and what it was being used for is, in many ways, the story of the entire opioid era. The Veterans Administration's opioid prescribing practices in the late 1990s and early 2000s followed the same general pattern as civilian medicine, influenced by the same pharmaceutical marketing, the same clinical guidelines, the same cultural shift toward pain as the fifth, vital sign. VA physicians who were prescribing opioids to veterans with chronic pain were, in many cases, following the standard of care as it was then understood. They were doing what they had been trained to do. The patients they were treating had real pain that was not being adequately managed by non-opioid approaches that the VA was, in many regions, not sufficiently resourced to provide anyway. Physical therapy waitlists at VA facilities stretched into months. Psychological services for post-traumatic stress, which has a well-documented bidirectional relationship with chronic pain, were similarly backlogged. The veteran who came in with back pain, an unaddressed PTSD, and a 3-month wait for a mental health intake was offered what was available now, a prescription. It was not a malicious decision. It was an insufficient one, made within an institution that was not resourced to make a better one. And the consequences played out over years in the bodies of people who had already given what the country had asked of them. The VA data on opioid prescribing was, for years, difficult to access systematically. The VA system maintains its own records infrastructure, separate from civilian prescription monitoring programs, which meant that a veteran who was obtaining opioids from both VA and civilian providers, something that did happen, was invisible to both systems simultaneously. The interoperability failures of American healthcare information technology were, in this context, not just an administrative inconvenience. They were a structural gap that allowed a particular form of dangerous prescribing to continue undetected. The veterans who became dependent on opioids prescribed for their service-related injuries occupy a particular moral position in the larger narrative of the crisis. These are people who were harmed by injuries sustained in service, who were treated by a federal healthcare system with a federal drug, who developed a condition that the federal mental health infrastructure was not equipped to address. The individual story is of a person who followed the instructions of their doctors. The systemic story is of an institution that failed, repeatedly, to connect the dots between what it was prescribing and what it was creating, and that inherited the consequences long after the acute moment of deployment had passed. Long before epidemiologists had the data to confirm it, certain communities knew something was wrong. Small towns in Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky began noticing in the late 90s and early 2000s that something was different about the drug problem they were seeing. It wasn't marijuana or methamphetamine, the usual suspects. The people showing up in emergency rooms, dying in living rooms, losing jobs and children in years, were people who had started with prescriptions. legal, doctor-issued, pharmacy-stamped prescriptions. The local pharmacist noticed that certain doctors were prescribing at rates that defied logic. The county coroner noticed a new cause of death appearing with uncomfortable regularity. The school counsellor noticed kids whose parents had changed in ways that were hard to name but impossible to miss. The data would come later. The grief arrived first. Scott County, Indiana, Kanawha County, West Virginia, Jackson County, Kentucky, Scioto County, Ohio. The names of the communities that bore the earliest and sharpest weight of the prescription opioid crisis are not famous ones. They are places that were already economically stressed before the pills arrived, communities where the manufacturing base had collapsed, where median incomes had declined, where the social infrastructure that buffers hardship had been thinning for decades. The opioid crisis did not create that vulnerability. It arrived inside it, amplified it, and consumed it. The relationship between economic despair and opioid use is real and documented, but it requires careful handling. Poverty does not cause addiction. Economic stress does not predetermine opioid dependency. Most people who live in economically distressed communities, including communities that were heavily affected by the prescription opioid crisis, did not become dependent on opioids. The relationship is probabilistic, not deterministic. What economic despair does is increase the density of risk factors, stress, trauma, limited access to healthcare, limited access to alternatives, while reducing the availability of protective factors. The drug that was being widely prescribed in these communities was doing its pharmacological work inside a social environment that made recovery from dependency significantly harder than it might have been elsewhere. The town that noticed also noticed something else. The response was slow. State health departments that were receiving mortality data were slow to connect the dots. Federal regulators who were receiving prescribing data were slow to act on it. The pharmaceutical companies whose drugs were appearing in the toxicology reports of overdose victims were active in lobbying against the regulatory responses that might have slowed their sales. This is documented. It is not conspiracy theory. It is the public record of the civil litigation that eventually produced billions of dollars in settlements, and the congressional testimony and the investigative journalism that traced the flow of pills from manufacturing to distribution to the medicine cabinets and the street corners of Scioto County. The town coroner who filed the first reports noting the unusual overdose pattern. The high school principal who started seeing the same last names over and over in the list of students whose parents were incapacitated. The emergency room physician who recognized, looking at a shift's worth of presentations, that something had fundamentally changed in what was walking through the door. These were the people who noticed. They noticed years before the policy response arrived. The gap between noticing and acting in communities where the people dying were not the ones whose deaths historically commanded urgent federal attention is one of the most significant failures of the entire story. One of the stranger dynamics of the Dilaudid black market is that it has always competed directly with heroin, and in certain respects has won that competition. From the perspective of someone who is physiologically dependent on opioids and has no legal access to them, pharmaceutical-grade hydromorphone offers something that street heroin categorically cannot: consistency. You know exactly what is in a Dilaudid tablet. You know the milligram strength. You know it was manufactured under federal oversight in a facility that follows good manufacturing practice guidelines. You know it has not been cut with fentanyl or levamisole or whatever the current adulterant of choice happens to be this month. For people who have watched friends die from contaminated street drugs, this purity is not an abstract benefit. It is the difference between a calculated risk and a gamble with unmarked odds. The street price premium that pharmaceutical Dilaudid commanded over black market heroin during the peak of its illicit circulation was not entirely explained by the potency differential. A significant portion of that premium was the purity premium, the value that buyers placed on knowing exactly what they were taking. This is harm reduction logic operating in a black market. It is not rational in the sense that participating in an illegal drug market is rational, but it is rational in the sense that given the decision to participate in that market, choosing the product with the more reliable safety profile is a coherent risk management decision. The heroin supply in North American cities during the late 1990s and early 2000s varied enormously in purity, from diluted samples that had been cut multiple times as they moved through the distribution chain to unexpectedly high purity product that produced overdoses in people whose tolerance had been calibrated to a lower baseline. Overdoses from purity variations in street heroin were a significant cause of death, particularly in people who had recently been released from incarceration, where drug use was suppressed and tolerance had dropped, and who returned to the street supply at their pre-incarceration consumption levels. The pharmaceutical pill did not have this problem. Dilaudid 4 milligrams was 4 milligrams every time. The label told you. The arrival of illicitly manufactured fentanyl into the street drug supply beginning around 2014 amplified the value of pharmaceutical purity dramatically. Fentanyl is so potent, so much of a lethal dose can fit on a surface too small to see, that the contamination of other drugs with it became essentially undetectable without laboratory testing. Counterfeit pills that appeared visually identical to pharmaceutical opioids began circulating containing fentanyl or fentanyl analogues in quantities with essentially no reliable ceiling. The overdose death rate, which had already been elevated for more than a decade, increased catastrophically, and the value of a pharmaceutical product with a verified milligram content, with a national drug code number and a manufacturer's lot number, and a chain of custody traceable to a licensed facility, increased correspondingly. The price of purity in this context is not just a street economics observation. It is an argument about what the war on pharmaceutical diversion accomplished. When regulators tightened access to prescription opioids, the demand that had been partially met by diverted pharmaceuticals shifted in part to the street drug supply. And the street drug supply by that point was far more dangerous than it had been before. The pills became harder to get, the fentanyl became easier to find, and the overdose rates went up, not down, at least initially. This is the complexity that the simple story, crack down on prescriptions, save lives, cannot accommodate. The logistics of moving pharmaceutical opioids from a point of legal acquisition to the black market are, in retrospect, almost embarrassingly simple. A person with a legitimate prescription fills it, sells some or all of it. The buyer resells it. The drug moves through personal networks, friends, family, co-workers, the guy at the gym who knows a guy, before it ever encounters anything resembling organized crime. This is what epidemiologists call diversion through personal networks, and it accounts for a substantial proportion of non-medical opioid use. It doesn't require a cartel. It doesn't require a criminal mastermind. It requires a surplus of legally obtained controlled substances and a demand that the healthcare system, in the name of pain management, has inadvertently created. The supply chain was, in its original form, a prescription pad. The interstate dimension of pharmaceutical diversion followed, in its early phase, the prescription pad model. Florida's absence of a functioning prescription monitoring program made it not just a source of pills for Florida residents, but a destination for buyers from Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, the so-called Oxy Express or Pill Express routes, documented by DEA analysts, law enforcement, and investigative journalists. People drove to Florida, saw a clinic, received prescriptions, filled them, drove home. The pills they didn't use themselves they sold. The profit margins were, by any standard analysis, extraordinary. The risk in an era before prescription monitoring programs or aggressive DEA scrutiny of out-of-state patients was relatively low. The Drug Enforcement Administration's distribution data, made publicly available through the Washington Post's Painkillers database, a dataset released as part of litigation, tells the story in aggregate form. Over the period between 2006 and 2012, more than 76 billion opioid pain pills were distributed across the United States. Certain pharmacies in small towns received quantities of opioids that bore no relationship to the size or demographics of the surrounding population. A pharmacy serving a town of 500 people that received 500,000 oxycodone tablets in a single year was not filling prescriptions for local patients with legitimate pain needs. That pharmacy was a distribution node. The pills were travelling. The organised criminal element in pharmaceutical diversion was, during the pill mill era, relatively peripheral. The real infrastructure was the healthcare system itself. As prescription monitoring tightened and pill mills were closed or prosecuted, a more traditional distribution model began to take shape. Pharmaceutical pills diverted from multiple sources being consolidated and moved along distribution networks that had previously handled other controlled substances. But even in this more organised phase, the product at the end of the chain had originated in a legal transaction, in a hospital or a pharmacy or a physician's office, before it was redirected. The gap between healthcare and street drug commerce was never as clean as either side preferred to believe. Here is an institutional irony worth sitting with. While Dilaudid and its pharmaceutical cousins were being prescribed at historic rates, the infrastructure for treating opioid addiction was chronically, almost criminally underfunded. Addiction medicine was a specialty that most medical schools did not emphasize. Residential treatment programs had long wait lists and high costs. Medication-assisted treatment, using drugs like methadone or buprenorphine to manage withdrawal and craving, was available but stigmatized, associated with what critics described as replacing one drug with another, as if the relevant variable was the drug rather than the person dying. The people trying to treat opioid addiction in the 90s and 2000s were working with tools that were underfunded, undervalued, and often actively opposed by the same communities that were losing people to overdose. The history of addiction medicine as a specialty is, in part, a history of trying to convince the rest of medicine to take addiction seriously as a medical condition. For decades, it was treated as a behavioral problem, a failure of will that required counseling, faith, and community support rather than pharmacological intervention. This was not without foundation. Behavioral and social interventions do help, and the evidence base for them is real. But the insistence that medication had no role in treatment was not evidence-based. It was ideological. It came from a set of cultural assumptions about what addiction was and what addicted people deserved that were not derived from clinical research. Methadone maintenance therapy, in which patients with opioid use disorder receive daily supervised doses of methadone, a long-acting opioid that prevents withdrawal and craving without producing the euphoric cycle of shorter-acting drugs, has been available in the United States since the 1960s. Its efficacy in reducing overdose deaths, criminal activity, and HIV transmission is among the most robust findings in the addiction treatment literature. It is, by the standards of evidence-based medicine, a highly effective intervention. It is also, in the United States, subject to a regulatory framework that restricts dispensing to federally licensed clinics, requires daily attendance for most patients in early treatment, and has been cited, when it has been cited at all, in opposition from communities that did not want methadone clinics in their neighborhoods. Buprenorphine, marketed as Suboxone, received FDA approval for the treatment of opioid use disorder in 2002. Unlike methadone, it could be prescribed in office-based settings by licensed physicians, which meant it could be dispensed at a primary care visit like any other medication. It was a genuine step forward in accessibility. It also required a special DEA waiver to prescribe. The X waiver, a regulatory hurdle that did not exist for prescribing the opioids that created the problem in the first place. A physician could prescribe Dilaudid with a standard DEA registration. Prescribing the medication to treat Dilaudid dependency required a separate certification and a patient cap. This asymmetry, easy to cause the problem, hard to treat it, is not an accident of regulatory history. It reflects, quite accurately, where the political will was and was not. The story of Dilaudid as the black market's favourite painkiller has a complicating epilogue. Fentanyl. When illicitly manufactured fentanyl began flooding the drug supply in the mid-2010s, it changed the calculus for everyone. Fentanyl is roughly 100 times more potent than morphine and 50 times more potent than pharmaceutical-grade heroin, which means the margin between a dose and a fatal dose is thin enough to be measured in micrograms. The introduction of fentanyl into the street drug supply made the purity advantage of pharmaceutical Dilaudid even more valuable to people seeking opioids, because the alternative was now genuinely Russian roulette. At the same time, it made the overall landscape of the overdose crisis dramatically worse, spiking death rates in ways that the Dilaudid era, bad as it was, had not approached. Fentanyl is not a new drug. It was synthesized in the 1960s by Paul Janssen, who intended it as an intravenous anesthetic and analgesic for surgical settings. For decades it was used almost exclusively in that context, administered by anesthesiologists in controlled, monitored environments where its rapid onset and brief duration were clinical assets. The transdermal fentanyl patch, introduced in the 1990s for management of chronic cancer pain, extended its use into outpatient settings under physician supervision. The drug was known, well characterized and respected. In the operating room where it belongs, it is excellent. What illicitly manufactured fentanyl represents is an entirely different category of problem. It is synthesized in clandestine laboratories, primarily in Mexico using precursor chemicals from China, and introduced into the street drug supply through a distribution network that has no interest in consistent dosing or user safety. Because it is so potent, it is economically attractive to distributors. A kilogram of fentanyl has the pharmacological equivalence of 50 kilograms of heroin and can be transported in a package the size of a shoebox. Because its concentration in any given pill or powder cannot be verified without laboratory testing, every use is a gamble. The displacement of pharmaceutical Dilaudid from its position as the preferred black market opioid by illicitly manufactured fentanyl and fentanyl-contaminated supply did not happen because fentanyl was better. It happened because fentanyl was cheaper to produce, easier to smuggle, and, once it was in the supply chain, difficult to displace. People who would have preferred pharmaceutical hydromorphone, for the purity, for the consistency, for the measurability, were increasingly finding the pharmaceutical supply restricted as monitoring programs and prescribing controls took effect, and the fentanyl supply expanding as the distribution network adapted to the opportunity. The death toll that followed is historical fact. Overdose deaths in the United States, which had been rising steadily through the prescription opioid era, accelerated sharply with the rise of illicitly manufactured fentanyl. Tens of thousands of deaths annually. This was not what the regulatory crackdown on prescription opioids was designed to produce. It was not the intended consequence. It was the predictable consequence of reducing supply without addressing demand, in a market flexible enough to substitute one product for another, a product that was, from a lethality standpoint, dramatically worse. The partial redemption arc in the Dilaudid story, the part that gives researchers and clinicians something to hold on to, is the gradual, hard-fought acceptance of medication-assisted treatment as a legitimate, evidence-based approach to opioid use disorder. Buprenorphine, marketed as Suboxone, and methadone, dispensed through licensed clinics, do not cure opioid addiction, but they reduce overdose deaths. They reduce the chaotic lifestyle that comes with active addiction. They give people enough stability to work, to parent, to show up to the therapy appointments that address the underlying reasons the drug filled the space it did. The evidence base for these treatments is robust and has been for decades. The political and cultural resistance to them has been equally robust, and dismantling that resistance is a slow, unglamorous, ongoing project. The phrase medication-assisted treatment itself is, to some critics within the field, a linguistic concession to stigma. It implies that medication is an assistant to the real treatment, rather than the treatment itself. Proponents of changing the terminology to pharmacotherapy for opioid use disorder argue that we do not describe insulin as medication-assisted treatment for diabetes, and that the distinction reflects a residual belief that addiction requires moral transformation that medication can only facilitate, not accomplish. This debate is ongoing. The outcome of the terminology fight matters less than the outcome of the prescribing fight, which is, are physicians able and willing to prescribe buprenorphine to patients who need it, and are patients able to access and afford it? The ex-waiver requirement, which restricted buprenorphine prescribing to physicians with a special DEA certification, was eliminated in the United States in 2023. This was a meaningful policy change. It removed a significant barrier to access at the primary care level, where most people with opioid use disorder encounter medicine, and where the relationship infrastructure to support long-term treatment is most likely to exist. A patient who can receive buprenorphine from their primary care physician in the same setting where they receive care for their other health problems is in a fundamentally different situation than a patient who must navigate a specialized clinic with limited hours and a waiting list. The evidence on what happens when buprenorphine access improves is consistent across studies in multiple countries. Overdose deaths decline, treatment retention improves, quality of life measures improve. This is not a controversial finding. It is one of the most replicable findings in the clinical literature on opioid use disorder treatment. What remains controversial is the policy environment that determines whether that treatment is accessible in any given community, whether insurers will cover it, whether pharmacies will stock and dispense it, whether physicians will prescribe it, and whether the communities where opioid use disorder is most prevalent will organize their social support systems around recovery in a way that makes the medication effective rather than merely available. The revolution, if it can be called that, is incomplete, but it is real, and the people who spent decades fighting for it, who testified before hostile legislative committees, who published in journals nobody was reading, who treated patients in underfunded clinics and watched them survive, deserve more credit than the narrative of the opioid crisis usually affords them. There is a category of historical witness that official records cannot fully capture: the families of people who became dependent on Dilaudid or who died from overdose. They are the people who cleaned out apartments and found prescription bottles, dozens of them, from dozens of doctors, who sat in courtrooms watching civil litigation against pharmaceutical manufacturers, who testified before state legislatures about what it felt like to watch someone they loved change, slowly and then completely, into someone unrecognizable. The evidence is not clinical. It doesn't appear in pharmacokinetic studies or formulary management guidelines. But it is the record that makes the clinical literature legible, that gives the numbers their weight and the policy debates their stakes. The family member of someone with opioid use disorder occupies one of the more isolating positions in American healthcare. For years, the cultural narrative around addiction defined it as a choice, one that the person with the addiction had made and that their family had, to varying degrees, enabled or failed to prevent. This narrative produced extraordinary amounts of shame, which produced silence, which allowed the scale of the crisis to grow largely unrecognized by the institutions best positioned to respond to it. Families grieving opioid deaths did not, for years, grieve publicly. Obituaries noted brief illnesses or accidents. The specific cause was unspoken, because the specific cause carried a stigma that extended to the family, and that the family had done nothing to earn. When families began speaking publicly, through advocacy organizations, through congressional testimony, through the investigative journalism that connected individual stories to pharmaceutical industry conduct, something shifted. Not immediately and not completely, but the parent standing before a Senate subcommittee with a photograph and a timeline of their child's path from post-surgical prescription to overdose death was not a statistic. They were a person making the abstract particular. They were the mechanism by which the data became, in the public understanding, something other than a public health problem, and became instead a scandal. The civil litigation that eventually produced multi-billion-dollar settlements from pharmaceutical manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacy chains was built substantially on the discovery process. The internal documents that showed what companies knew about diversion, about addiction rates, about the disconnect between their marketing claims and their epidemiological data. Families whose loved ones had died filed suits that created the legal standing for that discovery. The documents they eventually helped surface, the emails, the sales training materials, the data analyses, were the evidence that the companies had preferred to keep internal. The families who kept the evidence were not initially lawyers or policy experts. They were people who saved prescription bottles because something in them knew the bottles mattered, before they had any mechanism to make them matter. The grief of these families is not a rhetorical device in the story of Dilaudid. It is the most accurate measure of what the story cost. Every other metric, overdose rates, prescribing volumes, diversion incidents, corporate settlement figures, is an abstraction from that grief. The families understood that before anyone else did. There is an uncomfortable argument embedded in the Dilaudid story, and it is this. The demand that drove the black market was real. People wanted these drugs, some because they were addicted and had no other options, yes, but many initially because they were in pain that the healthcare system had failed to address adequately, or in psychological distress that no one had given them language or resources to process. The black market for pharmaceutical opioids was not simply a story of vice or weakness or criminal enterprise. It was also a story about a healthcare system that had created a gap between the pain people were actually experiencing and the tools it was willing to provide to address that pain. The drug filled that gap. Not cleanly, not safely, but it filled it. Chronic pain is among the most prevalent and most undertreated conditions in the developed world. Approximately 20% of adults in the United States live with chronic pain, defined as pain lasting 3 months or longer. For a significant portion of those people, the available non-opioid treatment options, physical therapy, anti-inflammatory medications, interventional procedures, psychological pain management, complementary therapies are either insufficiently effective, insufficiently accessible, or insufficiently covered by insurance. The honest conversation about the opioid crisis has to include this, that the demand opioids met was not manufactured. It was pre-existing. The pharmaceutical industry exploited it. Yes, the prescribing culture amplified it. But the underlying unmet need was real. The black market in this context was functioning as a de facto substitute for inadequate healthcare access. This is not a defense of illegal drug markets. It is an observation about what it means when a market exists and persists, despite significant legal and social pressure to eliminate it. Persistent black markets generally indicate persistent demand that legitimate markets are not meeting. The opioid black market's persistence, through decades of law enforcement, through pharmaceutical crackdowns, through the successive waves of regulatory response, is, in part, a data point about the scale of unmet need in American healthcare. The specific character of that need, chronic pain, trauma, psychological distress, the kind of overwhelming stress that opioids are extraordinarily effective at temporarily extinguishing, points toward the parts of healthcare infrastructure that were most inadequate. Mental health treatment access, chronic pain management beyond opioids, addiction treatment. These are not obscure specialties or edge case concerns. They are the conditions most commonly found in the histories of people who developed opioid use disorder, and they are the conditions that the healthcare system was least equipped, and in some cases least willing, to address. What the black market taught us about pain, then, is that pain does not wait for the healthcare system to be ready to treat it. It finds a solution, and the solution it found in the early 2000s was a molecule that the healthcare system had enthusiastically distributed for a decade, then tried to reclaim. The gap between distribution and reclamation is where the crisis lived. The gap between unmet need and available treatment is where it lives still. Beginning in the early 2010s, regulatory pressure on opioid prescribing began to tighten. Prescription monitoring programs became mandatory in most states. The DEA scrutinized prescribers whose controlled substance volumes were outliers. Medical boards sanctioned physicians. Pill mills were raided. Insurance companies tightened prior authorization requirements, and prescriptions for Dilaudid and other opioids dropped dramatically. What also happened, with a timing that should have surprised no one and surprised almost everyone, heroin use spiked. Then fentanyl arrived. People who had been using pharmaceutical opioids, now cut off from their supply, turned to street drugs that were cheaper, easier to obtain, and catastrophically less predictable. The crackdown reduced prescriptions. It did not reduce the underlying demand, and demand without a pharmaceutical supply finds another way. The CDC opioid prescribing guidelines, published in 2016, were designed to give primary care physicians clearer guidance on dosing thresholds, duration of prescribing, and patient risk assessment. They were not mandatory, they were guidelines, but they functioned in many clinical environments as de facto standards against which individual prescribing could be evaluated for liability purposes, and the result in many practices was a significant and rapid reduction in opioid prescribing that was not adequately paired with a transition plan for the patients who were already on high-dose regimens. Patients who had been managed on long-term opioids for years, in some cases on doses that exceeded the guidelines' thresholds, received notifications that their prescriptions would be reduced or discontinued. In many cases, no comprehensive tapering plan was provided. No transition to alternative pain management was arranged. No addiction treatment was offered to patients whose long-term opioid use had crossed into physical dependence. The patient who had been receiving high-dose opioids for 5 years was, in a significant number of documented cases, sent away from the prescribing relationship with a taper schedule and nothing else. The outcomes were predictable. Some patients found new prescribers, some achieved successful tapers, some bought pills on the street, some switched to heroin, some died. The CDC guidelines were subsequently updated in 2022 to emphasize that abrupt discontinuation was not recommended, that patients on existing regimens should be carefully managed rather than abruptly cut off, and that the guidelines should not be used to justify inadequate pain management or the abandonment of patients who are currently being treated. This clarification was necessary because the original document had been widely misinterpreted or accurately interpreted and misapplied in ways that produced harm. Guidelines issued in a litigious, politically charged environment have consequences that extend beyond their literal content. The consequences of the crackdown were distributed unevenly. People with stable healthcare relationships and adequate resources to navigate the system, to find new prescribers, to access alternative treatments, to afford the co-pays for rehabilitation services, managed the transition better than people who had fewer resources to begin with. People who were already marginalised, already at the edges of the healthcare system, already managing other stressors, bore a disproportionate share of the harm. This pattern is not unique to the opioid crackdown. It is the pattern of most blunt regulatory interventions applied to complex social problems in healthcare. The measure works, imperfectly, on average, and does so at a cost that falls unevenly. Litigation against opioid manufacturers has produced, through the mechanism of legal discovery, a remarkable body of internal documents. What those documents show, in aggregate, is that pharmaceutical companies understood, in many cases years before regulators or the public did, that their products were being misused at scale, that the dependency risk was higher than their marketing suggested, and that the educational materials they were providing to physicians were optimized for sales rather than safety. This is not a secret anymore. It has been adjudicated in courts, settled for billions of dollars, and documented in journalism and academic research. What remains is the question of what accountability looks like at an institutional scale, and whether the settlements, large as they were, bear any proportional relationship to the harm that was done. The most extensively documented case is Purdue Pharma, manufacturer of OxyContin. Its internal documents, released through the bankruptcy proceedings and litigation that culminated in the dissolution of the Sackler family's control of the company, showed a degree of deliberate misrepresentation that is difficult to characterize as anything other than knowing fraud. Marketing claims about the drug's abuse potential were made in the face of internal data that contradicted them. Concerns raised by internal researchers about addiction rates were addressed, not by changing the marketing but by developing counter-messaging. The company's response to early evidence of diversion was, in part, to document the problem internally and continue the marketing externally. Purdue was not the only company operating in this space, but it was the most aggressive, and its conduct shaped the industry context in ways that implicated many other actors. The distributors who moved hundreds of millions of opioid pills to pharmacies in communities that clearly could not consume them through legitimate medical use had data, their own data, showing that something was wrong. The DEA's own suspicious order monitoring system, which required distributors to flag and report orders that exceeded normal patterns, was designed specifically to catch exactly the kind of distribution anomalies that were occurring. The distributors flagged some orders, they filled others. The system that was supposed to catch the problem was staffed and funded by the industry it was supposed to monitor. What made the internal documents so devastating when they finally surfaced was not that they revealed a secret. The opioid crisis was not a secret by the time litigation began producing discovery. What they revealed was the gap between what was known internally and what was being said publicly, and how long that gap had persisted. Emails from Purdue executives acknowledged that OxyContin was being crushed and snorted. Sales training materials instructed representatives on how to handle physician concerns about addiction by emphasizing the distinction between physical dependence, which the company characterized as a manageable physiological adaptation, and true addiction, which they characterized as rare. The distinction was real, but was being used in ways that minimized risk, rather than accurately communicating it. The Sackler family's role in directing the aggressive marketing strategy is documented in the litigation record. Members of the family who sat on Padue's board received briefings on sales performance, on diversion rates, on the opioid crisis as it was developing, and on the strategies being employed to protect market share. This was not passive ownership. It was active participation in a marketing enterprise that was, by the evidence of its own internal communications, aware of the harm its product was causing and structured its public communications to minimize that awareness in the medical community and the public. The settlement numbers are large. McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, and Cardinal Health, the three largest pharmaceutical distributors, agree collectively to approximately $21 billion in settlements. Johnson & Johnson settled for $5 billion. Purdue Pharma, through its bankruptcy, agreed to a settlement structure that, in its original form, which was subsequently rejected by the Supreme Court, would have included billions from the Sackler family, structured to limit their personal liability. These are large numbers by any individual standard. By the standard of the harm they are meant to address, hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions of people with lasting impacts of opioid use disorder, entire communities whose economic and social fabric was altered by the crisis. They are harder to evaluate. The money from settlements has been directed in part to opioid remediation efforts, addiction treatment infrastructure, naloxone distribution, prescription monitoring programs, workforce training. The allocation of these funds has been uneven, contested, and in some cases slow. Some communities received meaningful resources, others received bureaucratic processes and long timelines. The gap between the settlement announcement and the moment when a specific person in a specific town can access a treatment bed that did not previously exist is not a gap that headlines measure. The criminal accountability that accompanied the civil settlements was, by most assessments, inadequate relative to the scale of the conduct. Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges in 2007 and again in 2020. Individual executives at Purdue received misdemeanor convictions in the earlier proceeding. In the more recent proceeding, the company pleaded guilty to felony charges, but the personal criminal exposure of the Sackler family members who directed the strategy remained a point of fierce contention in the proceedings. The legal architecture available for holding corporate actors criminally responsible for public health harms that play out over years and involve complex chains of causation is not well suited to this kind of case. That is not an excuse. It is a structural observation about the limits of the legal tools available. The accountability that litigation provides is financial and evidentiary. It is also public and permanent. The documents that emerge from discovery are in the public record. The testimony of company executives, the internal communications, the sales training materials, they exist. They are readable. They constitute a body of evidence about what institutional knowledge of harm looks like when it is subordinated to the institutional interest in continuing to produce harm. This is, in the end, one of the most lasting contributions of the litigation to the historical record. Not the money, but the evidence. The evidence that a company can know, in granular and documented detail, that its product is killing people and continue to sell it and continue to be for years legally permitted to do so. That is the thing the documents prove. It is not a comfortable thing to know, but it is better to know it than not to. Not every chapter of the Dilaudid story is a descent. Some communities confronted with the visible toll of opioid dependency in their emergency rooms and coroner's offices and school enrollment figures did something other than wait for federal guidance. They built harm reduction infrastructure. They trained first responders to carry naloxone, the opioid overdose reversal drug. They opened supervised consumption sites in legal grey areas or with explicit political backing, where people could use drugs without dying alone. They funded low-barrier addiction treatment and peer support programs staffed by people with lived experience. The outcomes in these communities were measurably different from communities that responded to the same crisis with law enforcement and moral condemnation. The evidence accumulated. The political will to act on it spread unevenly. Vancouver, British Columbia, is the example cited most frequently in the international literature. Its downtown Eastside neighbourhood, one of the poorest urban postal codes in Canada, was at the centre of a public overdose crisis in the late 1990s that produced visible, daily death in a small geographic area. The provincial and municipal response eventually included Insight, the first legally sanctioned supervised injection facility in North America, which opened in 2003 after years of advocacy, research and political negotiation. At Insight, people who use drugs can come with their own drugs, receive clean equipment and inject under the supervision of trained healthcare workers who can administer naloxone if an overdose occurs. No drugs are provided, no judgment is administered. Medical and social services are available for people who want them. The research on Insight is extensive. It has not produced a single overdose death in the facility in more than 2 decades of operation. It has produced thousands of referrals to addiction treatment from people who might not otherwise have had a point of contact with the healthcare system. The neighbourhood around it has not become a drug tourism destination. The property values have not collapsed. The concerns that opponents raised before it opened have not materialised in the ways predicted, and the outcomes its proponents promised have. The evidence, in other words, is clear and has been clear for years. What has varied is the political will to act on it, state by state, province by province, city by city. In the United States, supervised consumption sites operated in legal grey areas for years before receiving explicit legal authorization in certain jurisdictions. 2 sites in New York City, On Point NYC, opened in 2021 and reversed over 1,000 overdoses in their first year of operation without a single death on premises. The federal response was not immediate prosecution, as some had feared, but neither was it immediate expansion of funding and authorization to other cities that had been waiting for clarity. The sites operate as demonstrations, as arguments in an ongoing policy debate, as places where people are staying alive while the debate continues. The debate is real and involves legitimate considerations about community impact, resource allocation, and the message that sanctioned drug use sends. But it is conducted over the bodies of people who are dying in the meantime, and that asymmetry is worth naming. The naloxone distribution model is perhaps the clearest example of a harm reduction intervention that moved from contested to mainstream within a single decade. Naloxone, sold under the brand name Narcan, is an opioid antagonist that rapidly reverses overdose by displacing opioids from their receptors. Administered in time, it brings a person back from respiratory depression that would otherwise be fatal within minutes. It has no abuse potential. It does not produce euphoria. It is extraordinarily safe, with no meaningful overdose risk. When it was proposed as a community-distributed product, available to first responders, family members of people with opioid use disorder, and anyone who might encounter an overdose, the opposition it faced was not pharmacological. It was moral. The argument was that naloxone would enable drug use by removing the deterrent of death. This argument was made. It was taken seriously in some policy circles. It was made about a medication that reverses overdose. The communities that chose not to wait for that argument to resolve itself, that trained police officers and firefighters to carry naloxone, that stocked it in community centres and libraries and high school nurses' offices, that made it available without prescription at pharmacies, accumulated evidence that the argument was wrong. Naloxone availability does not increase drug use. It reduces overdose deaths. These are different outcomes, and the evidence distinguishes them clearly. The communities with early, broad naloxone distribution saw their overdose death rates diverge from comparable communities that did not. This is one of the cleaner natural experiments available in the public health literature on opioid harm reduction. The peer support model runs alongside these structural interventions as the human infrastructure of recovery. People with lived experience of opioid use disorder, employed as recovery coaches and outreach workers, are more effective at engaging people who are currently using drugs than credentialed healthcare professionals alone. This is not a criticism of credentialed professionals. It is a recognition that trust, in the context of profound institutional distrust, is built by shared experience, and that the person who's been in active addiction and found their way to sustain recovery carries a kind of credibility that no degree program can confer. Cities that funded this workforce, that created career pathways in recovery support services, that paid people for the knowledge their own lives had given them, built something more durable than a program. They built a community's capacity to reach itself. What these cities share is not geography or politics or resources. What they share is the decision to treat the overdose crisis as a public health problem rather than a moral failure, and to organise their institutional responses accordingly. That decision sounds simple. In the political environments where it had to be made, it was not. It required elected officials willing to absorb the accusation of enabling drug use. It required health departments willing to fund interventions that the federal government had not endorsed. It required community organisations willing to show up for people that many community members would have preferred not to see. It required, in other words, a particular kind of civic courage that the crisis demanded and that not every community found. The ones that found it saved lives. That is the whole sentence. It is enough. Here is where the Dilaudid story refuses to wrap up neatly. Hydromorphone is still on every hospital formulary. It is still prescribed for post-surgical pain. It is still diverted, still sold, still the drug of choice for people who want pharmaceutical-grade opioids and have the connections to obtain them. The crisis that made its name synonymous with a particular kind of institutional failure has evolved but not ended. The drugs have changed. Fentanyl has largely displaced the pharmaceutical market in many communities, but the underlying dynamics have not. People are still in pain. The healthcare system is still imperfect in its responses. And somewhere between a prescription pad and a street corner, something that was meant to help is still finding its way to harm. That gap between intention and consequence, between medicine and addiction, is the thing the Dilaudid story was always really about. The clinical guidelines are better now. Prescription monitoring programs are linked across state lines in most of the country. The pharmaceutical industry is under scrutiny that it was not under in the late 1990s. Medical education includes more robust training in pain management, addiction screening, and the risk assessment of opioid prescribing. Emergency departments have protocols for opioid-related presentations. Hospital formularies have safeguards and reconciliation requirements that did not previously exist. Automated dispensing machines generate controlled substance reports that are actually reviewed by actual people on actual schedules. Healthcare workers in recovery have more pathways to treatment and more protections against career-ending disclosure than they once did. The pharmacist has a database. These improvements are real. They are the direct result of a tremendous amount of work by clinicians, researchers, public health advocates, regulators, families who refuse to stop making noise, and people with lived experience who forced an institution that prefers to manage its own reputation to confront what it had contributed to. And yet the overdose death rate in the United States, which briefly declined in 2018 and 2019, climbed again with the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic and has not returned to pre-pandemic levels. The pandemic's contribution to the crisis was not incidental. It severed treatment relationships, closed facilities, isolated people who depend on community support for their recovery, produced economic and psychological stress at a population scale, and dramatically reduced access to the healthcare appointments, where opioid use disorder screening and buprenorphine prescribing could have happened. The virus that closed the country also closed the infrastructure that was, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to address the addiction crisis. The deaths that resulted are counted in the overdose mortality statistics. They are not always identified in public conversation as pandemic deaths. They were. The fentanyl supply, which had established itself in the illicit drug market before the pandemic, continued to evolve during it. Illicitly manufactured fentanyl analogues, compounds with structures similar to pharmaceutical fentanyl but not identical, which in some jurisdictions fell into legal grey areas because they were not yet specifically scheduled as controlled substances, proliferated. Nitazines, a class of synthetic opioids structurally unrelated to fentanyl but similarly potent, began appearing in drug supply samples in multiple countries. The illicit drug supply is not static. It responds to enforcement, to supply chain disruptions, to the same market incentives that shape any other commodity market, and it has shown, over several decades, a consistent capacity to find and exploit the gap between what is regulated and what is available. Every scheduling action that removes one compound from the accessible market creates an incentive to develop the next one. This is not a counsel of despair about regulation. It is an observation about the limits of supply-side interventions when demand remains unaddressed. Dilaudid in this current environment occupies a position that is in some ways more clearly defined than it was at the peak of the prescription opioid crisis. Its role in the illicit market has been partially supplanted by fentanyl. Its role in the clinical setting has been more carefully circumscribed by guidelines, monitoring, and institutional oversight. The physician who today prescribes hydromorphone for acute post-surgical pain is working in an environment of documentation and accountability that the physician of the late 1990s would barely recognize. This is progress. It is incremental, imperfect, and real. What has not changed is the underlying pharmacology. Hydromorphone still binds to mu-opioid receptors with high affinity and produces analgesia, sedation, and euphoria in a dose-dependent manner. The brain that receives it still does what brains do with effective mu receptor agonists. The transition from therapeutic use to physical dependence still follows the same neurological logic it always has, indifferent to regulatory environments or prescribing guidelines or the accumulated policy experience of 50 years. The molecule does not know about the crisis it helped create. It does not know about the settlements or the guidelines or the monitoring programs. It knows, in the only sense that matters, how to bind to a receptor. Everything that followed from that binding, the decades of prescribing, the diversion, the black market, the legislation, the litigation, the grief, is the human story layered on top of the chemistry. And the human story is not finished. There are people tonight who are in genuine pain and who will receive hydromorphone in a hospital that manages it as safely as current knowledge and resources allow. There are people tonight who are dependent on opioids they can no longer access through legitimate channels and are figuring out what to do next. There are people in recovery tonight who are navigating the long, non-linear process of rebuilding a life that opioid dependency had reorganized around a drug. There are families sitting with something that happened and trying to figure out how to hold it. There are researchers running trials. There are clinicians seeing the last patient of the day. There are pharmacists reviewing the reconciliation report. There are peer support workers answering a phone call at an hour when phone calls mean something has gone wrong. The drug is still there. The people are still there. The work is still there. That is not a comfortable place to end a story. But it is where the story actually is, and the most honest thing that can be said about it is also the most important, that the gap between what medicine intends and what sometimes results is not a fixed feature of the landscape. It is a problem that human beings created, and human beings are working on it, and that work matters, even when the progress is slow and the losses continue, and the molecule in the vial remains exactly what it has always been, it's enough to keep going. That has always been enough to keep going. So tonight, as you lie here in whatever comfortable, temperature-controlled, structurally sound space you've arranged for yourself, with your functioning plumbing and your access to clean water and your pharmacy a short drive away and your doctor reachable by phone, let's sit for just a moment with everything we've walked through. We began in a German laboratory in the 1920s, with scientists trying to make something that would help people hurt less. That impulse was good. It was, in fact, one of the better impulses medicine has ever acted on. The history of pain management is, at its core, a history of human beings refusing to accept that suffering is simply the price of being alive and trying, with whatever tools they had, to do something about it. That part of the story deserves its due. What came after, the marketing, the pill mills, the diverted vials, the families who cleaned out apartments full of prescription bottles, the towns that noticed the coroner was busy before anyone in a position of authority was ready to listen, that part is harder to sit with. It asks something uncomfortable of us, not guilt exactly. Most of us didn't design the pharmaceutical incentive structures or write the prescribing guidelines or fund the lobbying that delayed the monitoring systems, but it asks attention. It asks the recognition that the systems we trust to keep us safe are made of human beings, and human beings, under certain pressures and incentives, do not always do what the system is designed for. It also asks something quieter, a little grace for the people who got caught in the machinery, the post-surgical patient who took the prescription and found themselves somewhere they never planned to go, the nurse working a double shift in a hospital that didn't give them enough support, the veteran who came home from somewhere terrible and was handed something that worked, for a while, at the cost of a great deal that followed. None of them were the villain of this story. The story doesn't really have villains, though it has some people who behaved with a degree of knowing cynicism that is very difficult to excuse. Mostly it has a system that moved faster than its own understanding, a drug that worked so well in so many ways that the working obscured the harm until the harm was very large indeed. Hydromorphone is still in the vial, the nurse is still drawing it up, the patient in recovery is still pressing the button and waiting for the warmth to spread. Somewhere in that process, in almost every case, something is going right. Someone is hurting less. Someone is getting through the night. Hold that. It doesn't cancel the rest of the story. But it's the reason the drug exists, and the reason it stays, and the reason the people who work in pain management and addiction medicine keep showing up. Now close your eyes. You've spent tonight in complicated company, in hospitals and pill mills and kitchen table conversations that families wish they'd had earlier, in the gap between what medicine intends and what sometimes happens when human need and human fallibility meet a very effective molecule. Sleep now. And be, if you can, quietly grateful for the people who are working to close that gap, for the researchers writing the studies nobody reads until everyone needs to read them, for the families who kept the evidence, and for every person in recovery who got to wake up this morning. They earned the morning. So did you. Good night.